Hey guys, welcome to the Little Big Synths YouTube channel. In today's video, I want to show you guys how to sequence your synthesizers using an external hardware sequencer. Hardware sequencers can be very useful production and performance tools to have in the studio, especially in cases where the synthesizers don't have a built-in sequencer of their own, or the built-in sequencer is limited in functionality or features. They can also be used as a central unit or brain for more complex setups that include multiple electronic instruments all playing together perfectly in sync. So for those looking to break away from the computer a bit more, a hardware sequencer is definitely the way to go. Nowadays, there are a lot of sequencers out there in all shapes and sizes, each with their own unique workflow and feature set. For this tutorial, I'll be using the Korg Electribe 2, but a lot of the ideas and concepts should apply to most other hardware sequencers as well. One of my favorite things about using the Electribe 2 is that in addition to sequencing, it is also capable of producing its own internal sounds, such as drums, synths, or samples. These types of devices are often referred to as groove boxes or music production stations. The Electron Digitact, Novation Circuit, or even the newer Roland MC series could also be put into this category. Dedicated or standalone sequencers such as the Korg SQ1, Arteria KeyStep, BeatStep Pro, and even the Arteria KeyStep Pro, which I'm really excited about by the way, do not produce any of their own internal sounds. Instead, they solely focus on sequencing and controlling other gear. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So the general idea here is that we want to use our sequencer to transmit or send MIDI messages to our receiving device, in this case a synthesizer, using a 5-pin DIN MIDI cable to connect from the MIDI out of the sequencer into the MIDI in of the synthesizer. Now, in most cases, we'll probably want to sequence multiple synthesizers at once, so to do that, we need to take that single MIDI output from the sequencer and connect it to all of our receiving devices. Some synthesizers, such as the Roland Boutique series, have MIDI Thru capabilities, which allow you to daisy chain multiple synthesizers together, using a combination of ins and outs. However, devices such as the Korg Volca series do not have MIDI Thru or even MIDI out capabilities. So in that case, we'll need to use a separate device called a MIDI Thru box. A MIDI Thru box is basically a signal splitter that takes a single MIDI input and splits that signal multiple ways. So a Thru box that has 3 outputs will allow you to connect up to 3 separate devices. From here, we can then use MIDI channels to designate MIDI messages to a particular device. So the sequencer can send or transmit MIDI messages on any of its 16 channels. And then the synthesizers can be set up to receive or listen for incoming MIDI messages on a specified channel from 1 through 16. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and bring in this Korg Volca bass and just show you guys how to sequence a single synthesizer using the Korg Electribe 2. Now, all you'll need generally is a standard 5-pin DIN MIDI cable, but in this case, the Korg Electribe 2 needs this adapter since it doesn't have a full-size MIDI output. And this adapter is just a 3.5mm stereo cable on one end and the 5-pin MIDI cable on the other. So we can go ahead and connect that to the output. And then using a standard MIDI cable, we can then connect from the MIDI adapter to the input of the Volca bass. So then with both devices connected, it's just a matter of setting up our MIDI channels. I'm going to go ahead and start here on the Volca bass by powering it on and holding the memory button at the same time. And right here you can see that it says channel 2, but you can set it up for any channel from 1 through 16 using any of the step buttons. Then we just press record to finalize our settings. So with the Volca bass set to channel number 2, I can then set the Electribe to channel number 2 by pressing and holding the keyboard button and selecting pad or part 2, which allow me to play the Volca bass with the pads on the Electribe. But one thing to keep in mind is that for each part on the Electribe, the oscillator type is set to saw by default. So in the amp envelope section, you'll want to use the level knob to bring down the volume of that internal sound, so that all we hear is the sound of the Korg Volca bass. Another thing that you might notice is that by pressing play on the Electribe, the sequencer of the Volca bass begins to play. I'm going to go ahead and clear this sequence, or just use an empty sequence slot in order to avoid any interference. So now with both devices set up, we can go ahead and begin programming it in some sequences. This first demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and use the real-time recording method for inputting steps. And one of the more obvious benefits of using an external sequencer, especially in this case, is that the Electribe 2 has 64 steps of sequence length versus the 16 steps of the Volca bass. So let's go ahead and set the pattern length to 4 bars by holding the shift button and pad number 2 here, and then using the value knob to set the length to 4. Now let's record in our sequence. I'm going to go ahead and add a melody using the Electribe's internal sounds, just for fun. Maybe some simple chords as well. Why not? Alright, so I have another pattern here with bass and drum sounds from the Electribe. And this time I'll be using the step sequencer and step edit feature to create a melody for the Volca bass. Just going to switch over to the sequencer mode and begin enabling each of the 16 steps. The step editor allows you to dial in the notes for each individual step in the sequence. Just press and hold the shift button plus pad number 12 to enter the step edit mode. We can then trigger each of the steps just by pressing any of the 16 pads. To make things easier, we can enable the scale mode so that all of the notes in the sequence conform to a musical scale. The Electribe has several scales to choose from, but I'm going to leave it set to this Dorian scale for now. Back in the step edit mode, I'm going to trigger a few of these steps and then use the value knob to select a note for each of those steps. In addition to note values, you can also edit the gate time and velocity values for each step, allowing you to really dial in your sequences. Alright, moving on. In order to connect multiple synths to the Electribe, we are definitely going to need a few more MIDI cables. 3 more cables to be exact. 1 for each synth. And since the Electribe has only one MIDI out, we are also going to need to use the MIDI Thru box. I'll be using this MIDI Solutions Quadra Thru. The Quadra Thru has a single MIDI input on one side and it has 4 Thru outputs on the other side. And there are other Thru boxes with more outputs, but since I only have 3 synths to hook up, this will be more than enough. So let's go ahead and get this connected. Okay, so I have the MIDI out of the Electribe connected to the input of the Quadra Thru, and then 3 cables going out of the Quadra Thru into each MIDI in of the 3 synthesizers. As I mentioned earlier, each pad or part on the Electribe is preset to a specific MIDI channel. 16 pads, 16 MIDI channels. So that means all I have to do from here is assign a MIDI channel to each of the 3 synths. Earlier, the vocal bass was already set to receive on MIDI channel 2, so I'll leave it there and move on to the rest. To test things out, I'll use the keyboard mode on the Electribe to select a channel and its corresponding synth. Now, to ensure we don't run into any problems, we need to do 2 more things. First, set each synth sequencer to an empty memory slot. And the second thing we need to do is make sure the synth sounds for the first 3 MIDI parts are produced by the hardware synths only, and not the Electribe's internal sounds. Right now, the Electribe's saw-type oscillator can be heard along with the sounds of the hardware synths. So I'm going to go ahead and set the Electribe's oscillator amp level to 0. And now you shouldn't hear the Electribe saw anymore. Only the Volca. Now with everything set up, we can begin sequencing some synths. I've already prepared a drum track as well, so we're ready to go. So I want to show you guys the real-time recording workflow one more time, just so you can see how quick and easy it is to build up a nice jam using an external sequencer like the Electribe. Alright guys, well I really hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was pretty long, but hopefully you guys found it somewhat useful or informative, at the very least somewhat entertaining. If you haven't already done so, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button before you go. I really do appreciate it. And until next time, thank you guys so much for watching Little Big Synths.